Hi, I'm Ron.
And I'm Don.
And this is the Ron and Don Show. Thanks for joining us today. I don't know what kind of spasm that is. I'm guessing it has something to do with the topic of today's show. We're going to talk about extreme cold. You okay, Don? In a previous episode of the Ron and Don Show, we talked about winter prep and getting your restaurants ready for cold temperature. Today, we're going to take a little bit different approach because we're going to talk about extreme cold and what you need to do to make sure your restaurant is ready for extreme cold.
But unusually cold weather only happens occasionally, but it can really be damaging. Assume that your restaurant is in Georgia and you're used to having it get down to freezing every winter, but suddenly they say it's going to be down to 10 degrees or 5 degrees. That's a lot colder than your restaurant's designed for. That would be no real problem for a restaurant in northern Michigan where 20 below is not uncommon, but 35 below, that's extreme cold for them. When you have a blue northern coming in and covers part of the nation, it'll come all the way down into Florida, into Texas, and up in the mountains in the west. When you have extreme cold conditions for your particular climate, what we're going to talk about today applies directly to you.
So, what do you do when extreme cold weather is coming to your restaurant?
First of all, you're going to have some advance warning. And I always sent out an email to all my restaurants when this was going to happen, telling them to be ready for it, and that email is on our website, so you can check that out. You want to have the HVAC guy come out and make sure all your furnaces and your makeup air furnaces are working in proper order. If the filters are partially plugged, get them replaced because you're going to be moving a lot of air through those air conditioners and furnaces on your roof. Next thing is make sure that you understand that your fire sprinkler system is going to be one of the problems that you're going to have.
Is that for both wet and dry fire systems?
For wet and dry, both.
Interesting.
The wet systems can freeze just because they've got water in them. The dry systems, oftentimes there's condensation in the spray nozzle itself that hasn't been removed during the annual inspections, and that'll freeze. And once that freezes and opens up that nozzle, now that lets the water, that takes the pressure of that dry system out and the water flows, and you will flood the restaurant just as if you split a pipe or a head in
a wet system.
In a wet system. And then the problem really occurs mainly on the outside walls where the sprinkler system is located and in the vestibules. And frequently it's in the corners of the outside walls and even more so in the northern and western corners. So you need to pay attention to those areas and lift the ceiling tiles in those areas to let the heat rise so that you don't freeze above the ceiling. In the vestibules, if you have ceiling tiles and a sprinkler head out there, leave the doors ajar and raise the ceiling tiles there so you don't flood your whole restaurant. Now, the problem with raising ceiling tiles is if you have ceiling tiles directly over that thermostat, don't raise that one because you'll be dropping cold air on that thermostat and your furnaces will never shut off and they could actually go off on high temperatures. So just be sure that you watch where your thermostats are for where you're raising ceiling tiles. And it's not 1 or 2 ceiling tiles. You may have to raise as many as 20 ceiling tiles for the overnight portion. Interior rooms which have plumbing, restrooms, where you have your bag-in-the-box, your carbonators, all that kind of stuff, those are generally controlled by thermostats in other rooms. So they may get quite cold and freeze. Prop open the doors to all restrooms and rooms that have plumbing internally. Do not allow your hood system to run overnight, especially with makeup air, because even with heated makeup airs, it's only bringing in you're taking out air that's 70 degrees and you're bringing in air that's 50 degrees. You're going to make your heaters have to compensate for that all night long, and they may not be able to. So shut down the hoods overnight no matter what. The energy setbacks on your air conditioning system to save energy, this is not the time you need to save energy. Shut them down so that your heat in your restaurant stays at 70 degrees. On the exterior walls where you have plumbing, particularly in restrooms, you need to have the hot and the cold water trickle through the night.
Why do you need to have the hot water trickle?
things happen when you heat up water in a water heater. First of all, some of the suspended solids come out of the water and it changes the exact freeze point. And you can actually, as the water temperature comes down in the pipe for the hot water compared to the cold water, when they hit equilibrium and then go down to the freezing point, the hot water will freeze before the cold water. And I think there's an ion change as well. But once you've heated up water in a water heater, it changes the freezing point just a little bit. And you can freeze up a hot water pipe right next to a cold water pipe, and nothing happens to the cold water pipe. It could happen to both.
Interesting. Okay, so we've talked about the front of the house, back of the house areas. I would imagine too, as I think about a typical restaurant, the boiler room generally has an outside door. Generally, that door could have a louver on it, and I would imagine there's a handful of challenges we can have in there as well.
Now, the problem is you have to keep the louvers open, because if it's an atmospheric water heater as opposed to a high efficiency, you've got to bring in the combustion air, otherwise you can have carbon monoxide poisoning that will get into the restaurant.
So that, in that case, that room's going to be heated with some kind of a heater, and maybe even baseboard heats as well.
Almost always.
Yeah.
And again, if you have water lines coming in through the floor near an outside wall, you may actually have to put a little electric heater in there to shoot at it to keep it from freezing, because the heater in the boiler room is oftentimes up high, and you might have a really cold water line down below. And then also, some atmospheric water heaters have a fresh air that comes in from the roof. Well, I've had them where they actually dropped right on the backflow preventer and split those $10,000 backflow preventers into a million pieces.
I would imagine too, there's also precautions that need to be taken with the water heater itself. I know that a lot of those things are set in certain energy modes and may not be running all night. So what precautions do we need to take there?
If you are saving energy by turning off your water heaters at night by a time clock, unplug the time clock for this time period, because you need the heat in that room in and of itself. And you have to also ensure that if you have any bypasses on that you keep it going. I would make sure that the circulating pumps are running just to keep water moving.
So after the event, the extreme cold event has gone, the water heater should be back in a condition where it's ready to service again.
Au contraire, mon frere. The water heater, if it's an older water heater, it will be taking in unusually cold water during this time period to heat it up for your use in the restaurant. You may have dropped the water temperature as a result of this event by 3 to 5 degrees for a few weeks. That water heater is going to work extra hard now to bring the temperature back up to the 140, 110 degree, whichever level you're taking it to. And therefore, you may well have to replace a water heater a month or two after this that you hadn't expected to replace that year.
That's a lot of particular attention to the boiler room itself. What else?
You know, it's kind of funny, but when you're walking around the restaurant, and especially in the boiler room, just make sure all the pipe insulation is secured in place and protecting the pipes as best you can. Just take a good look and throw some duct tape on them. If you have an exterior door that has some bad weather stripping for these overnights, put some duct tape or some other tape across all the seams of the door to act as a secondary weather stripping. And this is one of the few times when having snow piled up near the building but not against the building is not a bad thing, because it acts as a slight windbreak at the lower parts of the wall and can help reduce some of the incursion of this wind from particularly the north and west side, which is where you get the worst winds in these storms. But don't have it piled up against the building.
So there are some helpful points to deal with extreme cold when it's coming towards your restaurants. And that could be anywhere from Bangor, Maine, all the way down to in the southeast and southwest. This is, again, describing weather that's uncommon for the climate zone that your restaurants happen to be in. So I'm Ron.
And I'm Don.
This is the Ron and Don Show. Thanks for joining us today.